we'll have our returning secretary and treasurer, but there's also 3 directors at large positions. And I think one of them's coming back, so there's really 2 open positions, although anyone can run if you want to create drama. You can run for any position.
Good on the audio, Steve.
All right, now I'm on record. All right, so Brian sitting right here is the nominating committee chair, but we will be discussing our slate recommended by the board of directors tomorrow night at our board meeting. So if you think you might want to serve, let Brian know tonight, and we'll discuss it. But again, anyone can run, so you don't have to be on the slate. Speaking of our election is next month at our annual members meeting on May 27th. And there shouldn't be any other items of business as far as I know, other than the elections. And then I'll ask you all, are there any other announcements? Yes. All right, Patty. So great. All right, so there are free plants available in the back for those who are willing to adopt them. Thank you, Patty. Are there any other announcements? All right, let me jump with the raffle descriptions. I got about 10 minutes. We have a huge selection of raffle plants tonight. As I mentioned, we've run out of cups. So we need to reassess how much stuff we bring next time. As always, I start on this end, and this here is a classic native plant raffle donation. You got 2 species in this pot, but the main one is native shrubs. Actually, it's more of a medium-sized tree. At maturity, it tends to have a teardrop shape. Real pretty flowers that start out white and turn purple. It's a coastal species, so if you live near the coast or in the Keys, it's very salt tolerant. They changed the scientific name of this from Papyrus, which is a lot more fun than the new name, which is now Quadrella, something or other, Gemicidae or something. Okay, thank you, Gwen. Fragrant flowers. So we also have another little plant here. This is a pineland privet, which is Fourqurean segregata. It's in the olive family. This is one of my favorite shrubs. It can get to be about 10 feet tall. The pineland's supposed to be a little bit smaller, but it makes a great screen because the wood is very soft. If you ever do your own yard work, how many of you do your yard work? Raise your hand. All right. Real soft wood, easy to cut. Unlike some other species, like some of the stoppers have really dense wood. This is a great plant, fast growing, and it provides a lot of cover. We also have a white stopper seedling here. This is a nice native. It tends to be a more vertical stopper. This will grow in shade fairly easily. It does have fragrant flowers. It does have leaves that emit kind of a skunky aroma, but it's not bad, and it's usually in the evening, so neighbors might think you're smoking something. But I like this. I have 2 or 3 of these in my yard. Of course, I do have a ponytail, so. Here we have, this tree here is a black ironwood, which is Crugiodendron ferrum. Slow growing tree, a great tree. I have one in my yard. It will have black fruit that attract wildlife. This is one of 2 native species whose wood is so heavy it won't float. Very dense wood, makes a great club. But this is a hammock species. And we have 2 examples of 2 wild lime trees. This is a plant for the giant swallowtail butterfly. And this is native to hammocks also. They do have recurved thorns, so you might want to put it not near a sidewalk or where you bump into it a lot, unless you plan on pruning it in perpetuity. We also have a nice native fern. This one's an unusual one. You can't necessarily get it in trees. This is Adiantum tenarum, or brittle maidenhair. And this grows in hammocks. It's usually a lithophyte, which means I've planted this in the ground and it does fine. So this is a really nice native fern that'll grow in shade. We also have another butterfly host plant here. This is a privet cinna. And this is in the legume family. It's an Acisopenoid subfamily. It has these yellow flowers that kind of look like orchid tree flowers. This is a host plant for about 3 different sulfur species. Those are butterflies. The cloudless sulfur is one of my favorites, but it's also a host plant for the orange barred. And Mary, do you remember the third one? Sleepy dog or large orange, maybe. We have a couple of vines here. This looks like it's a native milk pea. Oh, no. It's Centrosema. Who brought these? That's good. This is a spurred butterfly pea. It's a cousin of milk pea. They're both in the legumes and the papilionoid subfamily. This will have large pink flowers, large for this vine. It's a pine rockland species, and this is another one that's hard to get. It's not in cultivation much by native plant nurseries. So this is a great takeover. So it fits in nicely to any pine rockland. All right, so this does not look like succulenta. Who brought these? Did you? Okay, then I'll trust you. This is a Ruellia succulenta, which is a succulent leaf petunia or wild petunia. And this is in the acanth family. It has these large purple flowers that fall off if you just look at them wrong. This is a nice pine rockland plant, full sun. And more pine rockland stuff ahead. So here is the pine rockland or the pineland varnish leaf, which is Dodonea angustifolia. This is the shrub, not the coastal tree. So this one usually gets to be about 4 or 5 feet tall. This will have these fruits that are winged. So there might be habitat forage for like doves and stuff that'll eat the seeds, but I'm pretty sure this one might be wind pollinated. So, but it's an unusual tree that isn't in many yards and it needs a cut. There you go. All right, so here we have a native Galactia. This is Galactia volubilis, is our one of the, and these are host plants for some of the skipper butterflies, things like the long-tailed skipper will often use milk peas. They'll probably use that Centrosema too. This would be good on the edge of a pineland or on a mailbox. Real pretty little purple flowers and not a very large vine. So it's nice. Here these look like fragments of some flavor. Oh, they're solidagos. So this is one goldenrod, which is Solidago stricta. And this is another pine rockland or prairie species. This will have inflorescence be anywhere from this tall to that tall. And for those of you listening online, about 2 feet to 4 feet. And the flowers are secund. The heads are secund. They're all on one side of the blooming stalk. That's what secund means. It grows in best in full sun. Here, mine's bloomed in winter. Usually solidagos bloom in the fall, but this one will bloom several times a year. Here we have us for a yard. This is the orchid stem passion vine, and this does have flowers that look like the passion vine we're all familiar with down here, but they're tiny and not very showy. The reason why you put this in your yard is because it's the host plant for 3 very special butterflies, one of which is our state butterfly, zebra longwing, but it's also a host plant for the Julia longwing and the Gulf fritillary. If you plant them in shade, you'll get the zebra longwing. If you plant them in sun, you'll get the Gulf frit and the Julia. Here we have a couple other natives. Here's a balloon vine. This is a cardiospermum. I think it's corindum, right? So this is the Keys one. And this has bigger balloons, and they also call them heart seeds. If you look at the black seed, it has like a little white heart on them. And this is was once thought, I think they still think it's a host plant for the probably now extinct Miami blue butterfly. But who knows, maybe we'll get lucky. We also have the pineland croton. another host plant for very rare, two rare butterflies that are endemic, which means they're found nowhere else in the world. And one of them is called the Bartram scrub hair streak, which occur, and both of them occur in Pine Rockland. The other one is called the Florida leafwing. Bartram scrub, it's theoretically possible that if you live anywhere near like Richmond or near Everglades, you might get this in your yard if you plant a lot of these plants, because you're close enough for the butterflies to possibly venture into your yard. The story of the Atala butterflies, last population was left on Key Biscayne, and then Roger Hammer spread caterpillars around Dade, and now the Atala butterfly occurs all the way up north to Orlando. And half of its population occurs in people's yards. So if you plant these plants in your yard, even for the rare things, you never know, you might help things down the road. So here we have a shortleaf fig, which is Ficus citrifolia, and this little tree will become enormous in your yard. So I have one in my yard. It's a must for any birder or for anyone who loves wildlife. The only tree that comes close to providing forage for wildlife is the oak. This one produces fruit year round, and its cousin, the strangler fig. And it's the host plant for the ruddy daggerwing, and it is a great bird tree. Like, I've seen the coolest birds in my fig. I've seen cuckoos in my figs. I've seen all the different warblers, from black-throated blues to common yellowthroats to any of the rare ones, along with vireos and orioles and everything. So if you want all the birds to come to your yard, you really should have a native fig. Here we have Simmons aster, which used to be Aster simmonsii. Now it's Symphyiotrichum simmonsii. So someone got their graduate degree. This is another nice one that grows in full sun, has big flat, what we call, are actually compound flowers. It's actually an inflorescence called a head. It's in the sunflower family. And this is a perennial. It kind of dies back in the winter and then comes back from the ground. All right, I'm running out of time, folks. I'll call out a couple more and then I got to stop. This is a special one. I'm surprised no one's put tickets in it. This is man in the ground. The microdactyl has thick red flowers. Beautiful Pine Rockland vine. Kind of a tricky one to get very little seeds. So to find this plant grown by seed. We have a cousin, another native morning glory, which is Pine Rockland morning glory, and this is Ipomea tenuissima. It has real soft, color purple flower, but this is a great plant for a Pine Rockland garden. Ooh, good. So this is the native twin flower. See, being sold at native plant nurseries being called down here. Different from this. This is different. It's also like the Aurelia. These have purple flowers, much smaller than the is not in cultivation except by Raoul, I guess. It's hard to stop. Rattlebox. This is a host plant for one of my favorite moths, which is the rattlebox, also called the Bella moth. This is a small herbaceous wildflower with yellow pea flowers. And the rattlebox moth is a butterfly that's a caterpillar. This is a great addition to any Pine Rockland garden. There's more stuff to see here, so I recommend you peruse them. A lot of them have questions on any of them. Feel free to ask me or Raoul about some, especially the ones that he's. All right. So tonight's speaker. My glasses. Okay, tonight's talk is Saving Seagrass to Save the Planet. Florida Seagrasses and Blue Carbon. And Jim Fourqurean is our speaker. He's a distinguished university professor of biological sciences and director of the Coastlines and Oceans Division of the Institute of Environment at Florida International University, where he has been on faculty since 1993. He is a marine and estuarine ecologist with a special interest in benthic plant communities. in nutrient biogeochemistry. He and his students address many aspects of ecological biogeochemical processes in coastal plant communities, including carbon and nutrient cycling, plant-plant interactions, plant-animal interactions, and the structure of food webs. His laboratory has extensively used seagrass ecosystems as models for addressing general ecological questions. Over the last 10 years, Dr. Fourqurean has been helping translate the science of carbon dynamics and coastal ecosystems into actionable policy and climate change mitigation strategies. He is one of the lead scientists in the International Blue Carbon Working Group and also serves as scientific representative of the International Blue Carbon for Climate Change Mitigation he's been representative to the International Blue Carbon Policy Working Group. These groups have been successfully in bringing the importance of carbon cycling and coastal ecosystems for climate change mitigation into the spotlight and helped influence the inclusion of coastal ecosystems into national greenhouse gas inventories. Dr. Fourqurean received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of Virginia and completed a postdoctoral fellowship working on the Tomales Bay LMER. All right, program at San Francisco State University. He stepped down from the office of president of the Coastal and Estuarine Research Federation, the world's largest association of scientists and resource managers who work concentrates on the coastal environment. Let's please give a warm welcome to Jim.
So my intro took all of my time, so
Hey, someone wrote it down and gave it.
thanks. All right, can you all hear me well enough in the back? I'm probably going to end up coughing. I'm sorry. And you guys aren't my normal group, and so I started in this plant science world as an oceanographer chemist who thought I knew about plants. And I got my job here at FIU after doing all my research in Florida Bay. And there were just so many great botanists there that taught me how little I knew about plants. So I think I've continued my interest in chemistry, but I've developed an interest in really understanding how these plants work. And what I'd like to do today is talk to you about seagrasses, an evolutionarily ancient but not very successful group of plants that are really important in South Florida. And then I've like crammed two talks together. I've also thrown some slides in about climate change mitigation and the importance of coastal habitats and the carbon in them for climate change mitigation strategies. So show of hands, how many people know anything about seagrass? I know Ricky does. All right, so a few of you. How many of you know there are flowering plants that live under the ocean? All right, still not everybody raising their hand, but I think people are just shy. All right, and it's always so seagrasses are just flowering plants that live underwater. And this is Thalassia tesnudum or turtle grass. I'll probably just call it Thalassia for the rest of the talk. And how many of you have ever seen flowers of seagrass? All right, 2, 3. Is this male or female, Ricky? That's the male flower. So seagrasses are kind of strange in that almost all of them have separate plants for separate sexes. So that's the male flower, and that's the female flower. Most people have seen the female flower, but not the male flower for a reason I'll show you a little video about in just a little while. So these are just flowering plants that return to the sea. They're really a basal monocot. The first ones kind of evolved about 100 million years ago in the time of the dinosaurs. Seagrasses, though, are an ecological agglomeration. They're not a taxonomic unit because being a seagrass has evolved multiple times. A thing is called a seagrass generally, but this is a guideline more than a hard and fast rule. If it grows fully submerged in the ocean, that it is secured by anchoring and root system, it's adapted to life in salt water. It means they don't do well at all in fresh water in general. They have flowers that are pollinated underwater. And the last one says they can compete with other marine organisms. So these are general guidelines that are held for some genera and not held for other genera. There are genera that some people think are seagrasses and other people don't, but I'll speak more about that in a little while. So it's a lot like being a mangrove. You know, you're a mangrove if you live in the mangroves and you're a flowering plant. And so you're a seagrass if you live in the seagrass areas and you're a flowering plant. So this has been really confusing for a long time. People don't understand the difference between seaweeds and seagrasses. And in the early 1970s, there was very little known about seagrasses. And the first book came out on seagrasses, this handbook of seagrass biology. And the editors sent it off to the publication house who said, we need a dust jacket. The author said, well, we don't care. Put on whatever you want. So the dust jacket for the book is all seaweeds. You know, these there's not a seagrass on there. So monocots evolved, and then like the first branch, this is basically Elismatalides. This is where all of the seagrasses are. And we got the lilies and the palms. They're not grasses. You know, seagrasses are not grasses. So they diverged about 100 million years ago, whereas the macroalgae split off about 2 billion years ago. So the seaweeds have got like a 2 billion year head start on the seagrasses. So, but even though this is an ancient group of flowering plants, there's only 50 to 60 species. And I don't think I put this anywhere else in here. That's because they don't have any way of getting CO2 out of the ocean at its current pH very well. So they're all carbon dioxide limited. We can talk more about the chemistry if you want to. So they were really successful 100 million years ago when carbon dioxide was about 8 times higher in the atmosphere than it is today. In their current place, they're not doing very well. So maybe in the future, it's time for seagrass as we're putting all those fossil fuels back in the air. But I'll talk about that more.
Did they evolve out of water, in the water, or did they evolve out of land?
Probably they were a land plant that became a freshwater aquatic that then became adapted to saltwater, and that happened at least 3 times, probably 4. All right, so they don't all look like grasses, and these are just some pretty pictures. This is manatee grass, which is common in Florida, Syringodium filiforme. It's the one we find on the beach that you can roll in your fingers like spaghetti. You know, it's got round terete leaves. This one is one of my favorites. This is Posidonia oceanica. This is one of my field sites in the Mediterranean. It grows down to 35 meters, 100 feet deep in the beautiful blue Mediterranean. As a side story, Pinna nobilis, this is a huge pen shell. It's about this big. It was almost driven extinct in the Middle Ages because popes wanted vestments made out of the byssal threads, you know, the little threads that hold these things down into the ground, because they're beautiful and nacreous. So you get about that much byssal thread out of each one of those organisms, and they wiped them all out of the Mediterranean so that popes can wear vestments made out of them. They don't all have a classic grass-like leaf. This is Halophila spinulosa. This is in relatively deep water in a place I work in, Shark Bay. So we have 3 or 4 or 2, talk about that in a minute, members of this genus in Florida, but they don't look anything like that. Some of them, in fact, look more like sea shrubs than sea grasses. This is another common genera in Australia and Shark Bay, another place where I've been able to work. And then some of them are so tiny that people don't even notice them. This is probably the world's most broadly distributed seagrass. It's right there. The leaves are about this big. They occur in all of the deep water ports. Everywhere that the Portuguese and the Spanish went in the 1400s now has this species growing there all across the Pacific, all across the Atlantic, all across the ocean. But no one ever sees it because it only lives in places where people don't like to go, where it's dark and muddy. So there's quite a lot of morphological variation in the seagrasses. So this is a phylogenetic tree, and why I put this here is these are places that the seagrasses evolved. So Hydrokerataceae is one family, and there's Posidoniaceae, Rupiaceae, maybe Cymodocieaceae, and Zosteraceae. So those are the families listed there. So I say sometimes Rupiaceae because rupias some people think they're seagrasses, some people don't. So the one we have in Florida, for instance, Rupia marittima, can grow from prairie potholes and basically subtundra areas, both in Alaska and down in Argentina, right through full strength marine seawater in Florida Bay. So it gets knocked, it's supposedly not a seagrass because it doesn't require salt water because it can live in fresh water. But some people call it a seagrass, some people don't. So in Florida, we have native species from 4 or maybe 5 genera, if you include Rupia. We have Simodosiaceae, Syringodium and Haliduli in the Simodosiaceae, Thalassia and Halophila, which look nothing alike, from the Hydrocerataceae, and sometimes Rupia is counted. So these are those native species. So Haliduli wrightii, I have a question mark. Steve was asking me about the taxonomy of these things. It's a mess because mainly the people that described the seagrasses were oceanographers, and they didn't understand that things like leaf tips are a plastic character. So Haliduli wrightii was described by Kees den Hartog from a sample from Cuba, and it has a distinctive leaf tip that none of the Florida samples have. They don't have a leaf tip that looks like that. Their leaf tip actually looks like what was described Halophila bodettii. But Ron Phillips in 1960 published a book, The Seagrasses of Florida, and he got it wrong. So now everybody calls all the Haliduli in the Western Hemisphere Haliduli wrightii, but it's probably not. So if any of you are going to be students and interested in this, there's a dissertation to be had. But we're right now going to call it Haliduli wrightii. Syringodium filiforme, that manatee grass, the round one. Thalassia, which doesn't always look like this. This is from a kind of a coastal, relatively high nutrient environment, and it's relatively deep, so the plants get really long, trying to get up to the sun. This is that Halophila decipiens. Halophila anglemanii, I'm sorry you can't see it in the back. It's like this, except it has a whorl of 4 to 5 leaflets. And then, anybody heard of Halophila johnsonii? All right, this is our only supposedly threatened seagrass in the Western Hemisphere. It occurs all over inlet. That's the type specimen from it. It occurs from Indian River Lagoon down to about Key Biscayne. My phylogenetic friends have basically proved, though, that this is not a species. It's an invasive exotic from the Indian Ocean that showed up probably in the 1960s. It's within the clade of Halophila ovalis. So we're probably going to lose this as a species, and then the protection that some of the areas where it grows are having because the protected species were there, because it's probably, jury's still out, but it's probably just an invasive exotic. And then we got this Rupia down here. Rupia can look exactly like Haliduli, except the leaf tip shape. But said it can grow in freshwater or seawater. Okay, so most of them are dioecious. These are just Thalassia. This is the only picture and the only time I've ever seen a female and a male flower in the same place, because those are 2 different individuals there. Of Thalassia, so they set fruit. The fruit are ovoviviparous, so there's actually a sprouted seedling inside the fruit, and the fruit opens up. That sprouted seedling floats away. It's buoyant until it uses up all its sugar, and then it sinks. When it sinks, little hairs come out of the seed, and they kind of go down into the sand, and then they contract. So they actually pull themselves down into the mud. I forgot. So you'll find these floating in about 3 months. They'll be all over Crandon Beach. Those are the fruits. This is one that broke off before it dehisced and opened up. So that's what turtle grass reproduction looks like. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of seagrasses in South Florida, different kinds of seagrass habitats. Up in the northern part of Florida Bay and the southern part of Biscayne Bay, there's a lot of Halophila, really, because Halophila is a nutrient, I'm sorry, I'm saying the wrong genus, Haliduli. Haliduli is a nutrient-loving species. It's if you fertilize a Thalassia bed, a turtle grass bed, it turns into Haliduli. So there are places where we've got that kind of seagrass. It's mostly bare mud with little spit. It's kind of like a pine rockland understory, right? There are places with Syringodium, say down off of Marathon, where the Serengetium is that deep. Beautiful place. There are places, say out in the, especially the Gulf of Mexico, remember I said there's a species that really only occurs where people never go diving. So this is in kind of deep water, turbid environments with very little down there, but there's about 8,000 square kilometers of that out in the Gulf of Mexico that was pretty much unknown. In fact, it was unknown until got a project and went out there and looked for it. Mostly when you think of seagrass in South Florida, you think of turtle grass. You know, it's the one that's closest to the beach. It tends to be prettier and in prettier water. That turtle grass grows a lot of places, but it's restricted in its growth because it needs sediment. So wherever you get these kind of slimy rocks sticking up, you can't have seagrass. So the coral reefs are actually limiting the distribution of seagrasses. Can't have everything, right? So there's about 18,000 square kilometers of seagrass in South Florida. And considering that the world's distribution was purported to be 172,000 square kilometers, this would be 10% of all the seagrasses in the world. That's not true. Seagrasses are just very poorly known in their distribution. So, but we got a lot. We got a lot than almost anywhere else. And I'm sorry, for political reasons, Biscayne Bay looks like it doesn't have seagrass, but it has seagrasses in it as well. But it wasn't part of the study that I used to make this envelope picture from. Okay, so this is just a kind of a neat video, and I hope it shows in the back. So remember I said male flowers don't last very long? The reason they don't, this is a male flower right here, right there. So keep your eye on that. Hopefully I can make this play. So this is an infrared camera, and this is just at dawn. Oops. All right, try again. Bam, yeah. So pollen is really, really high protein. And it is one of the energy pills for the reef. Parrotfish love them. And we think this has basically been an evolutionary pressure that keep, all of the meristems for seagrasses are buried underground. So they can be trimmed off. Their leaves can be cut off, their flowers can be cut off without actually killing the meristems of the plant. But you know, my colleague Brigitte Van Tussenbroek took this. It's hard to find male flowers, so she'd find them at night when they're just starting to come out, and she'd put out her cameras and go away, and every single one of them gets whacked by a parrotfish. So they got to get rid of the pollen fast. So seagrasses occur from Eisenbeck Lagoon in Alaska down to Argentina and all around the world, tropical, temperate, et cetera. So they have a broader distribution than say salt marshes do or mangroves do. And we love seagrasses. This is a spaghetti diagram. There are all these things that control seagrasses. And we measure these things about seagrasses. But the reason we do, people care about seagrasses because they protect us from erosion, from storms. They're critical habitat for protected species. They support large numbers and a large variety of fish. They're a natural filter for nutrients. They're like the best ecosystem there is for getting rid of nitrogen pollution, for example. They're increase the resilience to disturbance. And this new thing I'll talk about a little bit more is carbon sequestration and carbon storage. So there's really high ecological value to them. There's a lot of things that eat them. But when I was a graduate student, I was taught nothing eats seagrass. Right? So the energy flow from seagrasses to food webs, I was told, was all going through the detritus cycle. All these leaves are being produced and they fall down and they die, they'd rot, and then things would come in and eat the rotted stuff in the bottom, bacteria. So I was a graduate student starting in 1979. No, I'm sorry, undergraduate then.
It was called like thoracic turtle grass.
Despite the fact it was called turtle grass. So anyway, you know why we thought nothing ate them? Because we killed everything that used to eat them, right? So in the 70s and 80s, there were almost no green sea turtles left. Manatees were pushed to the edge of extinction. Geese were hunted almost to extinction. So ecologists thought that all this biomass was being produced. It wasn't being directly grazed. It had to rot first. We now know that that's not true, and I'll tell a little story about that in a second. I don't know when I'm going to tell because I can't remember what slide's coming up next. There are really beautiful critical habitats. The small-toothed sawfish is a seagrass resident. All the seahorses in South Florida love seagrasses, et cetera. These are just an endangered species of seahorse from the Mediterranean and some zebrafish in Australia. They're just, great places. But so I said, I was taught that nothing ate seagrass, but now I've got a whole bunch of papers. We've been studying the effect that grazing has on these seagrasses because there's been a resurgence because of, I want to say misguided, but I'll save that for later. There's been a lot of conservation efforts, especially say green sea turtles. There are orders of magnitude more green sea turtles entering the beaches or leaving the beaches now than there were 30 years ago. And now there are places where you can go in the water and you can follow these things around and they just hammer the seagrass. They eat and eat and eat and eat. There's big remora on there too. Remora is almost as big as the turtle. So they graze. So it's a side story. 2005, I was lucky enough to have gone to high school in Bermuda. My dad was in the military. He retired. He got a job out there. So I went to high school out in Bermuda, and I had some friends, and they kind of kept track of me. They knew I was working on seagrasses. And in 2005, they reached out to me and said, Jim, can you come over and help us figure out where all our seagrasses are going? So mainly in the world, we lose seagrasses because we decrease water quality. Water gets crappy and the light can't get to the bottom. There's no more seagrass. Any of you been to Bermuda? It's in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, clearest water you can imagine. And the seagrasses weren't dying close to shore. They were dying far offshore. It was a mystery. So we started to have our suspicions. And the first experiment that helped us understand what was going on is we said, well, it looks like the seagrasses are disappearing. Let's put a cage over this and see what happens. So we built these cages and stuck them there. Sure enough, if you put a cage around it, they stop dying. But the weird thing is, you see, this is just a rebar mesh. And so this is all grazed away, but that's grazed away inside the cage, but then it's dense here. Yeah, so this is what we found out was happening. The turtles were basically eating through everything. And so much so that they were pushing their way into these cages to get those few bites that were left in there. So there are places, Bermuda now, seagrasses are functionally extinct because of the success of a single species conservation measure to protect green turtles. Why is that a problem? There's no more sharks to eat turtles. These are the white-tailed deer of the seagrass world. White-tailed deer are gone crazy because there's no wolves. They're gone crazy because there's no sharks anymore. So we're not sure that we're going to be able to get seagrasses back in Bermuda. For a long story. Okay, so most of the fish species that we eat here, well, many of especially the coastal things, stone crab, conch, shrimp, groupers, snappers, they all are dependent on seagrasses at some stage in their lives. So they're really important fisheries resources. They're really important in nutrient processing. I said earlier, this is an entire semester's worth of material that I can talk about. But that it basically regulates water clarity. It keeps the water clear, keeps those nutrients away from the plankton. And the sediment is stabilized underneath and the sands are not moving around. So if you lose seagrasses, all of a sudden there's a lot more sand movement, there's a lot more erosion from storms, et cetera. And that soil, it turns out, is full of carbon. And we'll talk more about that. I'll talk more about that in just a little while. This kind of buried carbon in coastal ecosystems is called blue carbon, not because it's blue, but because it's in the ocean. And just a minute, I'll move on to that. All right. So seagrasses need these things. Oops. too far. Water has to be clear. They require about 10 to 15% at least of the sun's light to reach them. Understory in a hardwood hammock is probably about 5% or less, you know, of the sun's light reaching the bottom. They have a really high light requirement. And that means a little bit of decrease in water clarity means a huge decrease in the bottom available in the deeper areas for seagrasses. And really, us not taking care of runoff, both for nutrients and sediments, has really driven the loss of seagrasses around the world. We're probably down 50% since the beginning of the 20th century. Stable salinity, moderate waves and currents, et cetera. So anytime we don't have those things, we lose our seagrass. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what's happening in seagrass in South Florida. How many of you remember the great seagrass die-off of Florida Bay of 1987? 1987. So I was working out there at the time, and Florida Bay, 2,000 square kilometers of protected Everglades National Park, seagrasses just started dying. And it took us 10 years to understand why. They were not dying because of nutrient pollution, like almost all the world's seagrasses have died. It was dying under this beautifully clear water. Took a long time, but the reason they died is the same reason there's all that carbon in the soil. It's because they live in anoxic soils. They're waterlogged and there's no oxygen in there. And remember, all the biomass is kept below ground because of the evolutionary pressure from the grazing turtles. So they have a lot of biomass underground, and plants need oxygen. You know, they can't survive without oxygen. And in the dark, they don't photosynthesize. So not only is there no oxygen down there, but we also don't have any iron, too much chemistry. But what that means is that when we run out of oxygen, bacteria use sulfate instead of oxygen to breathe with, and then that sulfate is turned into sulfide, which is the most toxic thing we know about. Parts per trillion level, it's deadly. That's why we hate the smell of sulfide so bad we run away. So that sulfide is really, really poisonous. So long and short, what happened in Florida Bay, this is over a decade's worth of work it took to understand, was decades of water management and then dry years led to kind of a salting up of Florida Bay. So salinities were high. There were like 40 or 50 at the time, and seawater is about 30. And we also had rising temperatures. And late in the fall, the day length goes down, and all the seagrasses were dying late in the fall when it was hot and salty. So hot, salty water doesn't hold a lot of oxygen, and Charles' law, and it doesn't hold a lot of oxygen, and then it's warm, so bacteria are continuing to respire. They use up all the oxygen in the water, then there's no more oxygen to go down to the roots, and then the roots die. So that's what killed seagrasses in South Florida, I mean in Florida Bay. So huge parts of Florida Bay disappeared. I gotta say, I cried the first time I drove a boat across here, and all the seagrasses had died. This had been a place that I knew of as the water was so dark because of the long grass growing up into it that I thought I was going to run aground. And then after the seagrass die off, I was afraid I was going to run aground because the water was brown chocolate mud, and I could only see about that far down into the water. So it was sickening. But we understand what's going on there now. But Biscayne Bay is losing its seagrasses for the classic reason that almost everywhere else has lost their seagrasses. Eventually, it's still that sulfide that kills them, but the sulfide's killing them because we're polluting the water, we're decreasing the amount of light reaching the bottom. This is basically, these are different shorelines starting in 1984 in the blue, coming to 2016 in the red. So that's the edge of the seagrass meadow in Julia Tuttle Basin. So it died from deep water into shallow water because deep water is where the light was affected first. We basically lost the seagrasses in all the northern part of Biscayne Bay because septic tanks, phosphorus pollution, uncontrolled runoff through our canal systems, et cetera. So this is, we know what the problem is. We got to fix it. This is what it looks like when these things are dying. You get these bacterial mats. You can't see this, but there's a yellow fog. That yellow is colloidal sulfur that's in the water because of all that sulfate reduction that's going on. And that, you know, that's killing it, but it's killing it because no light's reaching the bottom. All right, so we're losing seagrasses really fast. We're losing them, we figure on a global basis, about 2 to 5% a year. It's pretty fast. Considering that we're all worried about losing our tropical rainforests, we're losing them about 0.5% per year. And then if you think of, there are people that spend their lives trying to figure out what the dollar value is for ecosystem goods and services. So every ecosystem you could, you know, they're worth this much for provisioning and this much for habitat, et cetera. If people that did that originally, the most valuable habitat in the world are seagrass meadows at like $19,000 per hectare per year, compared to these tropical forests that we're so worried about losing. They're only 2,000, right? So what I'm trying to say here is not that we shouldn't protect tropical forests or coral reefs. We're losing seagrasses faster and they're worth more to us. And they haven't risen to the consciousness of the world. People, you can't see them, people don't care. In fact, most people live in places where we killed all the seagrasses 100 years ago. So we're losing them fast. But remember, there's all that carbon down there. And the thing that's driving global climate change, of course, is increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. There is no scientific controversy about this, by the way. Carbon dioxide is increasing. So the most famous ecological time series in the world is the Keeling curve. Up at Mauna Loa, a guy named Keeling in 1958 started measuring CO2 concentrations. And they've kept at it. So this red line is winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer. This is in the northern hemisphere in the tropics, but there's still this huge seasonal signal because the greening up of the continents in the northern hemisphere in the spring and summer sucks CO2 out of the atmosphere. You can measure that. And then when all that stuff falls down and then gets respired over the winter, that CO2 is put back into the atmosphere. You can measure that. So this is like the in and out breathing of the northern hemisphere. And the CO2 concentrations are going up and up and up. On a bit of a longer time perspective, this Keeling curve basically represents my entire life. And in my life, we've gone from carbon concentrations of about 310 parts per million to 440 parts per million. That's a huge increase, right? And it's being driven, we know, because of stable isotopic evidence and carbon-14 evidence, that's all deep ground fossil fuels that's being burned into the atmosphere. So we know what's causing it. And if you look at it over a longer time frame, this is over the last 1,000 years, the CO2 was bouncing around when people were hurting. There weren't very many people, you know, around 280 parts per million. Industrial revolution started here and started going way up. The blue there is things we know from the from ice cores, you know, little bubbles trapped in ice, and then the tan over there is what the Keeling curve actually is. Yeah, that's that hockey stick. So we're really increasing it. But if we take an even longer look, CO2 concentration is this straight line. So 100 million years ago, Hydrocerataceae, the Thalassia family, first arose, then the Cymodocieaceae and the Posidoniaceae, and then most recently the Zosteraceae, which was completely temperate genus. But see, it was 2,000 parts per million, not 300 parts per million at the time of the dinosaurs. That's when seagrasses evolved. And then there was this kind of rapid drawdown and the drawdown lasted until basically the Holocene. And during the Holocene, it was kind of stable. And then this little tick up right there is the hockey stick, at the very end. So there's been a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere before. So remember I told you that seagrasses are carbon limited at the current pH of the ocean? They're carbon limited because they evolved at a time when they didn't need to be able to use bicarbonate because there was all that CO2 dissolved in the water. But they're not doing so well now. So where'd all that CO2, where'd all the ancient CO2 go? Well, it was fixed into biomass. There was so much of it. Carbon dioxide was plentiful. Photosynthesis was outstripping the needs of all the animals. It sunk into the ground. It got buried. It got turned into coal. It got turned into oil and was sucked out of the atmosphere and stored underground. And then in the 1800s, we discovered in Pennsylvania that if you drill a hole in the ground, you could get this black stuff to come squirting up. So really, the Pennsylvania oil fields were the first kind of beginning of this major carbonization of the world's economy and really allowed the rapid economic development because all of a sudden energy was really, really cheap. So we're pulling it out of the ground, we're burning it, we're putting it back into the atmosphere way faster than it got pulled out of the atmosphere. So why are we worried about CO2 in the atmosphere? Well, it's the greenhouse effect. Greenhouses are places where clear light comes through the glass, it's absorbed, and the heat that is generated after the light is absorbed can't get back out of the glass, so it warms up. That's what's going on in the planet. That's why we're getting increase in CO2 and we're warming very rapidly. Well, why? I mean, aren't greenhouses good things? It allows us to grow more. Well, that happened in the Cretaceous. We had dinosaurs roaming the earth. It wouldn't have been very good for humans. So we've evolved at a time where there was less CO2, more CO2, probably not good for us. It's also really not good for the ocean because as CO2 goes up, pH goes down. And when pH goes down, then all the things that make calcium carbonate shells can't make calcium carbonate anymore. They get dissolved. So we're really worried about all of these things. All right. So we're putting 1.5 billion gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. Only 20% of that is because of cutting down of forests and losing seagrasses. 80% of it is burning of fossil fuels, but that 20% that's being driven by land use, land cover change has been the part of that CO2 release of the atmosphere that it has been politically tenable to try to control. Right? So we're trying to reduce the CO2 going into the atmosphere, that 20% that's coming from land use, land cover change. And one way we're doing that is by trying to get people not to cut down rainforests. I was actually having a conversation earlier today with one of my colleagues who was making a joke about the plastic bag that he had. How many of you are old enough to remember the days where plastic bags were the environmentally conscious alternative because they weren't killing trees? Remember that? We all asked for the plastic to save the trees. But so we're trying to not cut down trees. And that's I'm going to get to why it's called blue carbon. That's where I'm going. So anybody heard of RED? It's a United Nations program. It stands for the Reduction of Emissions Through Deforestation and Degradation. It was a program that was set up by the United Nations to take first world funding and pay people to not cut down their forests. And by doing that, there's a very easy calculation. If they're not going to cut down the forest, we know that so many tons per hectare per year are not going to be going to the atmosphere. There's a value of that. It's generally around $20 a ton on most of the markets. So in Brazil, if someone owned 5,000 acres and instead of turning it into a cattle farm, they kept it in forest, the United Nations set up this program that would pay them and they can make a living on their land. This program called RED is incredibly popular with developing, especially developing tropical countries. In Indonesia, it's like the #2 or #3 component of their gross domestic product is selling their land to not release CO2 to the atmosphere. So it's been really successful. But there's a value to carbon credits depending on politics. There was a time when we thought there were going to be mandatory carbon markets, and then the price of carbon went way up, and then it became a voluntary market, and the price of carbon went way down. But there are carbon markets. You can trade future tons of CO2 in the atmosphere, and there's the price goes up and down, but you can actually buy and sell and trade, and you can earn credits that you can sell on the market if you can prove that you're keeping, you get 1 ton of credits for every 1 ton of CO2 that you keep out of the atmosphere. And it's thought that about $30 billion a year in US dollars a year are flowing now through this red market into efforts to keep CO2 out of the atmosphere. So it's worth a lot of money. But the ocean isn't, the world isn't red. The world isn't green. The world is blue. Most of the carbon in the world is in the ocean. So that's where blue carbon comes from. Let's think in a red kind of spectromatic framework. Let's think about the carbon that's coming from the blue part of the planet. That's 75% of the planet anyway. And we know that in seagrasses and in mangroves and in salt marshes, there's a tremendous amount of carbon stored. And I showed you earlier that we're losing them faster than we're losing those tropical forests. So the blue carbon effort has been to try to bring value to conservation of these habitats to save the carbon that's stored in them from going into the atmosphere. Mangrove forests were excluded from red, even though they're forests, because in most countries, forestry division controls above high tide, and the oceanography or the fisheries division controls below low tide. Mangroves were outside of forestry's purview, so they were never included in red. So the first major victory we had in this blue carbon effort that started in Paris in 2008 was mangrove forests became classified as forests and basically became part of red and part of the greenhouse gas inventories. That's me. This is just Rhizophora, but Rhizophora, red mangrove, but forgot. This was in Costa Rica. Yeah, so they get really, really big. I'm not a small guy, and I'm 10 feet off the ground, and the prop roots are still 3 feet above my head. So this is just how much carbon there is in boreal pine forests, in temperate forests, and in tropical forests. That's the amount of carbon. And so this is the above ground material, and that's the soils. The darker stuff is in the muds. But see, mangroves have about the same amount of biomass as those other forests, the clear bar, but they have all that extra carbon in the soil because there's no oxygen in the soils. So carbon goes in and it doesn't come out. It just gets stacked up in there. And the reason we're losing mangrove carbon, please never buy $5 a pound shrimp, right? The only reason you can get $5 a pound shrimp is because over most of the tropics, they're building these temporary shrimp ponds in the mangroves. They dig out about 1 meter's worth of muck. They pile it up, they burn it, putting it directly into the atmosphere. They use these things for about 4 or 5 years. They get played out, and then they have to move them, and they have to move them, and they have to move them. So the farmed shrimp industry has a much higher carbon footprint per pound of production than the beef industry does. So if you're trying to save the world and save carbon by not eating beef, you should really not eat farmed shrimp. Okay. So we're just trying to figure out how much all this carbon in seagrasses is worth. I'm sorry, this is kind of out of order, but this is the net primary production. This is how much carbon is being produced and buried every year in seagrasses. And it's about 4 tons of CO2 per hectare per year. And that's quite a lot compared to, say, tropical forests. But that production value, the sinking of new carbon at $20 a ton is only worth about $88 a hectare, or $45 an acre. So there's not a whole lot of money in it, you know, from the perspective of first world economy. But, you know, a mature forest has a net primary production that's about equal to zero. It builds up a bunch of biomass and then it maintains it. So it's not the net primary production, not the production of new carbon that we're really interested in. It's all of that capital that's been created in the stored carbon within the system. So the value of forest carbon or seagrass carbon or mangrove carbon isn't that high rate of primary production. It's the not burning 1,000 years worth of accumulated carbon and sending 1,000 years of that net primary production into the atmosphere within a year. But when you take this $88 a hectare per year times 1,000, then all of a sudden you're getting $80,000 per hectare per year, and the value of that carbon, if you keep it from going into the atmosphere, all within 1 year. So that's where the money is in any kind of blue carbon framework. Let's stop the destruction of habitats. That's much better return on the money than creating new habitats, for example. Okay, so we had to figure out how much carbon was in seagrasses. We burned a lot of it and turned it into CO2. We measured what was in the plants and within the soil. That's me underwater in Shark Bay, drilling a core with a sledgehammer. So I showed you these pictures, these numbers before. That's the boreal forest, the temperate forest, the tropical forest, the mangrove forest. And then this is all of the world seagrass data that existed in 2012. This is kind of an older paper now. But you can see that there's as much soil carbon as there is in any of the other forests. And there are some seagrass meadows, so these are individual meadows, that have as much carbon stored in them as these mangrove forests. And what we're really trying to do over the last 10 years is figure out which ecosystems have all this carbon and which of them have very little carbon, because that affects, say, the value for conservation in saving them. So if you look at that 18,000 square kilometer green envelope I showed you earlier of seagrasses in South Florida, we figured that there's about 594 tons of CO2 in the top meter of soil across 18,000 square kilometers. That is a gigaton of CO2. And at $20 a ton, if all that were to go in the atmosphere, it would have a value of, what is it? I just lost it, $20 billion. So I'll skip over that. So I got a lot more I still want to. So how big are these blue carbon stores? The blue carbon stores are prodigious, right? So in seagrasses, there's about 4 to 10 petagrams. That's billion tons of carbon that's stored there. And we would really like to keep it there and keep it out of the atmosphere. And we're losing seagrasses really fast. This is data from the 1930s up through data in the 1990s. These are reported loss rates in the literature of seagrass meadows. So we're continuing to lose seagrass, and we're losing it at a faster and faster rate all around the world. Even though now it's protected in almost everywhere in the world, we're still losing it because we're really bad at taking care of our waste. So what are the consequences? Let me just get to this slide so I can talk about a couple other issues and let you all go. This is the dollar value in a carbon market of the carbon that's being released from the atmosphere by the loss of marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And we'll just take the seagrass number here. There's about this much of it. We're losing it at about that rate. This is how much carbon there is there. That's driving between 0.05 and 0.3 petagrams carbon CO2 per year going into the atmosphere, which has a cost, the total societal cost of carbon, of about $2 to $14 billion a year. So there's a potential market that's worth investing in keeping that carbon in the ground and using first world money and financing for carbon credits to keep that stuff in the ground. Okay, so there's a lot of carbon. We're still trying to understand why, and we can talk more about blue carbon, but I thought you'd probably be way more interested in here in about. Okay, what you can do to protect seagrasses. Avoid cutting them with your boat. Don't trample the grass. You know, I still get calls from people that are developing beachfront communities in Indonesia and Malaysia and Mexico saying, we have all this seagrass in front of our hotel and the tourists hate it. How can we kill it? What we really need to do is support our efforts to restore the Everglades because of the way that that helps us control the nutrient concentrations in the water running into our coastal zone. And we have to cut down, we have to increase water quality. We have to get rid of all the septic tanks. You know, there's still 150,000 parcels in Dade County on septic tanks. My house, 400 meters from the bay, is on a septic tank. I can't get on sewer, right? We have to get rid of those because crap goes in the septic tank, goes into the groundwater, flows right out into the bay. That's why we're losing our grass. And the sharks thing is, we've lost 98% of sharks in the North Atlantic Ocean because of long lining. And we now have orders of magnitude more turtles going into the ocean than we ever had before. There's nothing controlling those turtles. And that's going to be leading to seagrass issues in more places. Okay. Now, remember I said that Halophila johnsoni was probably a long ago invasive species that showed up here. Well, there's another invasive species that just showed up for the first time in December of last year, and we've been watching this. It's called Halophila stipulacea. So that's thalassia, right? And then this stuff here is all of this Indo-Pacific seagrass, Halophila stipulacea. It came through the Red Sea when they opened the Suez Canal in the late 50s, and it got into the Mediterranean. It spread across the Mediterranean. By about 1980, it had reached Gibraltar. And it was changing ecosystems in the Mediterranean. But in 2004, it showed up in Grenada. So it looks like it probably made its way across with some French or Spanish pleasure yacht that came across with seeds in their rope. And the first place that it seemed to take a toehold was in Grenada. And if you follow these dates, it moved from there to the Virgin Islands in 2018. So, you know, it took 14 years. It also spread this way. But it seemed to be kind of stuck here. We've been expecting it, though. We've been watching for it. And in 2024, so this was the latest report of its migration. Now we have it here. It's probably all along here too, and we just haven't found it yet. So this species is now in South Florida. We don't know what the consequences are going to be. That's Crandon Marina. This is the mother lode of that seagrass. Kind of maybe circumstantial evidence that it came in with a boater. And it's escaped from there, and it is now occurring along the mangrove shoreline. And it looks like, it looks very different than any of our native species. These blades are about that long. They're in pairs, they're elongate, and they have this very striking venation pattern when you look at them. And they're kind of curved as well. So it looks like that. Unless you really know what you're looking at, you think that this is just a short turtle grass meadow. But you see there's very little root material underground, and it grows fast. And reports for the Caribbean, we're still not sure if it's replacing native habitats or if it's moving into places that had died off. Right, so we're still trying to figure that out. It's now been discovered outside of Crandon Marina, moving north, Virginia Key, north of the Marine Stadium. We suspect that it's going to spread out, so everybody should be watching for it. We don't know what to do about it yet. Let me jump to the end. We don't know what to do because it fragments. Yes, ma'am. Well, there are some places in the Caribbean where scientists have looked at it And they have not found that it's supporting the ecologically and economically important species that are in seagrasses. Then there are other places that say it is. This is why we're not quite sure. You know, this is kind of happening really fast. We don't know how its habitat value is compared to our own species habitat. We just don't know. We also know that it fragments so very easily. And if we went and started digging it up, we're afraid that we could fragment it and spread it. So we're kind of in a quandary. Do we attack it now and do the best job we can, thinking even if we spread it, there'll be less of it to spread? Or do we wait to see if it comes under control itself? This is hot off the presses. There's a lot of discussions all the time what we should do about it. All right, so I'm sorry I took so long, but this beautiful Biscayne Bay scene, this is what we all have to lose if we don't take care of our seagrass ecosystems. You know, this is the color scheme of Miami. The vibe of Miami is really there because of blue water and seagrasses. And thank you all for listening, and sorry to keep you so long. Is there time for questions or no?
There's time for a couple questions.
Could you repeat them for the folks on YouTube?
Yes, if there are questions. If there are any questions. You know, manatees will eat anything. I've seen manatees hauled up on canals eating grass out of people's yards. I've seen them eating, but that doesn't mean they like it. There's not as much per bite of that stuff as there is in, say, long turtle grass. In St. Vincent, they say they won't. In Puerto Rico, they say it will. So it's early. There are different observations in different places. Oh, I'm sorry. So the question is, the invasive species, is that invasive species forage for our endangered species, especially our manatee? And I said, manatees will eat just about anything, but they don't get as much value per bite out of this smaller species. There's very little below ground material. Manatees will actually pull up all the below ground material and eat it. So we need to know. I'm sorry, I saw him next. And good. So the question is, can seagrasses be cultivated and transplanted? There's kind of a myth out there that seagrasses don't do well in culture, mainly because the sediment underneath them is anoxic. And oceanographers, not botanists, were working on this. So they were digging up chunks of seagrass and then trying to take that with all that anoxic mud and put it in aquaria. And it was difficult to grow. But it's not impossible to grow. And turtle grass is probably the worst species to try to cultivate because it has seeds with no dormancy. You can't collect the seeds. The seeds are dispersed. There are only a couple seeds per square meter that get produced. So there's not a big seed supply. I have a graduate student right now, though, who's being funded by a state of Florida effort to look at new technologies for seagrass restoration, who's focusing on manatee grass. Because manatee grass has hard seeds that are about that big, so you can track them. They have a hard seed coat. They're produced by the thousands per square meter in a season, so you can just go collect them all. So we're right now working on cultivating seagrass, syringodium from seed, with the idea that if we don't try to do turtle grass, instead if we do manatee grass, that'll create habitat value that will then eventually turn into turtle grass. So you can buy seagrasses for your marine aquarium. I'm not sure, I think it's illegal, but you can buy them online. I have them growing in the lab. I had a graduate student who, he asked me if he could grow seagrasses in the lab. I said, no, it doesn't work. Everybody tries it. It's not going to work. He said, okay. Then he said, Jim, you got that bottle of CO2 in the lab. Can I have that? Yeah, I don't know. What are you going to do with it? So he set up an aquarium in the lab, and I only get in the lab every couple months these days. And I went in the lab, and there was this beautiful turtle grass meadow growing in a 20-gallon aquarium. And the way he got it growing was he sparged it with CO2. He got the CO2 concentrations back to what they were in the Cretaceous. And when he did that, the stuff grows crazy. Yeah, thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Given that there is circumstantial evidence that this the halophilus spread by boats.
Mhm.
Um, and I've done a little bit of work on aquatic invasives, mostly freshwater, where you're talking hydrilla
Mhm.
and water hyacinth, things like that, that are also spread by boats. And the effort to control those things has been almost impossible without, there's an enormous amount of herbicide that is being spread in this state
Yeah.
to control hydrilla
Yeah.
and water hyacinth. And is there, I mean, are you standing under Niagara Falls with a teaspoon with regards to the new philosophy?
All right, so the comment and the question were that for many invasive aquatic plants, especially the ones in freshwater, the attempts to keep them from spreading have been deleterious. There's a huge amounts of herbicides that are being used, and it's not working very well. We're spending a lot of money, we're poisoning a lot of places, and it's not working very well. And are we looking at the same thing in the ocean? Boats have been going around for a long time, and it took a long time for it to get here. So I think there's a whole nother theory. Boats may actually end up being a small part of the problem. Everybody's heard of the sargassum problem, the Great Sargassum Belt. A colleague of mine has been working on seagrass problems in Puerto Rico for a long time. Was working on this seagrass meadow that was underneath a kind of a mangrove fringe. And at the end of the season 3 years ago, there was a huge sargassum rack that blew in from the ocean, blew up into the mangroves, and then got stuck and sank, and it killed all his seagrass. Came back the next year, and all of that area that had been killed was now Halophilus stipulacea. He thinks, and I think there's a lot of reason to think this, seeds are hitchhiking on Syringodium because the seeds are basically twice the size of a poppy seed. You know, they're really small. And we think that they may be hitchhiking rides. So the sargassum may be the thing that's given them, you know, it's the long distance dispersal. It may be more important than the boats. I would hate to see people put herbicides in the ocean. You know, I'm not sure what we can do. You know, I've only been working on seagrasses for 40 years now, and I can't tell you. I think we need to go and start removing it because if we don't do it now and it gets ahead of us, we'll never get behind it.
Follow-up question with removal, if they are small with a shallow root system, can you use a suction device to make sure that if you're digging it up, you get everything out of it?
Suction. So the question for you online is, are there ways of removing it with a suction device or other ways that could prove efficacious so that you're not fragmenting it or leaving seeds behind? Maybe. We need to figure it out. We don't know. Sometimes people have tried using siltation curtains. You know, you'll go in and you'll rip it all out. You'll use that siltation curtain, wait for everything to settle back down, wait, rip it all back out again, and do that a few times. But as far as I know, no one has any idea what the seed dormancy is on these things. So I don't know how long we'll have to do it. And they're so small that you could probably never check to see if you really got them all out. So it's a problem.
Two quick questions. We got it sounds like we might want to have green sea turtle back on our menu. If we can't get the sharks to take off. Anyway, I also want to ask who funds your research?
Okay. Two questions. Let me actually ask the one you didn't ask for an answer for. So I'm working in Bermuda, and Bermuda is a tourism and reinsurance business-based economy. And we went to the Bermuda, I'm working with the Bermuda government there. They fund my research there. And it became obvious to us and the people I was working with in the Bermuda government that we had to control turtles. But the Bermuda government would hear nothing about it because they didn't want their tourism image besmirched by casting aspersions on one of the most iconic and popular animals from the ocean for little children. So the Bermuda government refused to let us have a press release And in fact, we thought they were going to stop us from publishing our science. But the funny thing was, the minister said, oh, you can publish science. Nobody reads that, but you may not. So the problem is it's kind of cured itself because all the sea turtles died, right? So the big sea turtles aren't there anymore because there was nothing for them to eat. But then the problem is recurring because this is a very long story, not enough time, but Bermuda sea turtles are from all of the nesting populations in all of the Caribbean. And it's only a few turtles from each of those populations that are in Bermuda. So even if all of the ones that end up in Bermuda die, they're not going to have a negative impact on the production rate of new sea turtles back at their native nesting beach. There's just not enough of them. So this reign of small, because the turtles show up when they're about this big. They fall out of the plankton, they grow for 20 years till they're about this big, and then they go home. So we think that there's this now constant reign of little tiny turtles, but we're not having the big turtles there anymore because there's nothing for them to eat. My research has been funded. Oh, so the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, for most of the monitoring work we've done, was funded by an act of Congress in 1990 when Congress used to pass laws. And we've been funded for seagrass research from that since 1995. I'm funded by the National Science Foundation, by Florida DEP, by Monroe County, by Conservation International, by Nature Conservancy, and I'm leaving out. Many agencies are funding them.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, guys.
All right, there's still a chance to buy raffle tickets. There's still food. Please feel free to knock up some yummies.
Thank you very much. Great presentation. Thank you.